Your history textbook gave you the postcard version of England: tea, castles, royal ceremonies, and polite manners. But behind that picture was another story, filled with suffering, violence, and decisions that left millions paying the price. In the 1840s, while Irish families were starving, ships loaded with food continued leaving Irish ports under British protection. In 1919, thousands of Indian civilians gathered inside a walled garden in Amritsar, many of them peacefully. Across the British Empire, ordinary people found themselves trapped between powerful institutions and decisions they could not control. We start with money, because that's where much of this story begins. In 1833, Britain finally abolished slavery throughout most of its empire. On paper, it looked like a historic moral victory, but one detail changes the entire story. The British government borrowed an enormous amount of money to compensate the people who owned enslaved human beings. Around 800,000 people were being freed, but roughly £20 million went to more than 40,000 slave-owning families. Around 800,000 people were being freed, but roughly £20 million went to more than 40,000 slave-owning families. British taxpayers were left paying off the enormous loan used to fund that compensation. Incredibly, that debt was not completely paid off until 2015. Meanwhile, the formerly enslaved received no equivalent payment for the years of their lives that had been stolen. For many, freedom did not even mean immediate freedom from forced labor. The apprenticeship system kept large numbers of formerly enslaved people working for their former owners. Compensation records included prominent banking, political, and aristocratic families whose names remained influential for generations. The people who had been treated as property walked away empty-handed, while the people who claimed ownership received the money. And that was how the bill for freedom ended up being sent to the wrong address. But money wasn't the only way power was used. Sometimes the message was delivered with bullets. In April 1919, thousands of Indian civilians gathered inside Jallianwala Bagh in British-controlled Amritsar. The garden was surrounded by walls, with only a few narrow entrances and exits. A British officer named Reginald Dyer entered with about 50 soldiers and ordered them to open fire. The crowd had nowhere to run, and people desperately rushed toward the narrow exits. The shooting continued for around 10 minutes, with soldiers firing into the densest parts of the crowd. Dyer later explained that he wanted to create a lesson that would frighten others into submission. So surely someone was punished for what happened that day. Dyer was never criminally charged, eventually resigned, received a pension, and lived out the rest of his life in Britain. Ireland's famine unfolded much more slowly, but the suffering was just as devastating. In the 1840s, disease destroyed Ireland's potato crop, the main food source for millions of poor tenant farmers. The blight itself wasn't caused by Britain, but what happened after the harvest failed became one of Ireland's darkest chapters. Around 1 million people died, while another million or more were forced to leave the country. Yet Ireland continued exporting grain, livestock, and butter to England while people inside the country were starving. Those food shipments were sometimes protected by armed guards as they passed through starving communities. British relief policies were heavily influenced by the belief that large-scale assistance would interfere with the free market. Relief programs existed, but many were slow, harsh, or tied to difficult labor that starving people could barely perform. At the same time, landlords continued evicting families who could no longer pay their rent. Historians still debate how much of the famine should be considered natural disaster and how much should be blamed on government policy. But one fact remains clear: food was exported from Ireland while millions struggled to survive. In Kenya, decades later, the violence became more direct and systematic. During the 1950s, the Mau Mau movement fought for Kenyan independence and the return of land taken by British settlers. Britain responded by creating a network of detention camps across the colony. Inside those camps, detainees described beatings, sexual abuse, and other forms of systematic torture. For decades, the British government's official position was that many of these accusations were exaggerated or unproven. Then, in 2011, a huge collection of colonial documents was discovered inside a secret Foreign Office archive. The documents contained evidence of abuse and showed that officials had discussed how damaging information could be concealed. For the survivors, the truth had been buried for decades. But eventually, the paperwork survived long enough to tell the story. In 2013, Britain finally admitted that colonial forces had inflicted torture and abuse, agreeing to compensate more than 5,000 Kenyan survivors. But think about the timing. It had taken roughly 60 years for that admission to happen. And while that violence happened thousands of miles away, Britain had another history of using force much closer to home. In August 1819, around 60,000 peaceful people gathered at St. Peter's Field in Manchester to demand political reform and greater voting rights. Mounted soldiers charged directly into the packed crowd, killing between 11 and 18 people and injuring hundreds more. And that was only part of the empire's buried bill: money sent to the wrong people, violence against crowds, starving populations, hidden archives, and countless stories that survived only because something was never completely buried.